Hello, I'm Daniela. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I use a found object made of metal in my slow stitching. Now you can make little enhanced fabric charms with these, or you can use it as an entire focal point for your piece. These are little metal objects that you might find. It could be metallic ribbon, it could be thread, it could be jewelry findings. It's a great way to use broken jewelry in your work. It's also really interesting to use some metal findings as well, whether they're just metal rings or different things that you have in your collection and stash. So let's get started. So here are some items, some of these metallic found objects. You could play with metallic. It doesn't have to be pure metal. If it has a look of metallic, like sometimes they paint plastic, you'll have a button that looks metallic, but it's not. So anything like that is wonderful for this project. This is just some metallic ribbon, and I use that term loosely. I do think it's plastic, painted to look metallic, and because it's in a grid formation, I can cut this up, and it's very interesting. This is a charm from an old purse. I thought it was pretty. The purse was worn out, but the charm survived. This is a finding from some type of jewelry. I don't know what I'd use it for. This came off an old recipe box. I saved it. It's very heavy metal, so that's an option too. Here's another finding from jewelry. Same thing here. This is an old finding I keep in my metal stash. This is an odd earring. I could either take this apart and use any of the components, or just clip the back and use the entire piece. Here's another metal thing from my treasure box. Don't know where that came from. Here's an old pin for the holidays. This is another great idea to use for a metal. Or a key. This I think I bought as a charm, but you can find an old key just as easily. At the end of the video, I'll show you some different examples of using this technique. But right now, we're going to start by making our charm, and then I'll show you examples of how you can make different shaped charms in your work, or you can use it as a focal point for your work. So to make the charm, it's a very simple project. We'll add some stitching, not only to hold the charm, but to really make it into a stitched piece. But the focal point is that metal piece, or that faux metal piece, and that does all the work for you. And that's the beauty of it. I have a little piece of canvas as my backing. You can use any type of fabric you want. You could use quilted fabric. This is just a lightweight canvas, and I like that. So I'm going to really emphasize the rectangular shape of that key, since that's what I'm using. And I can trim this down further. I have some little thread here, some pearl thread, that matches my neutral fabric. And I tend to stick with neutral fabrics for this. That's just optional. I have some beautiful colors of embroidery floss. I don't have a project in mind for this particular charm, but I just love the way these two colors look with the metal. And my whole point in this is to create something that I enjoy. I also found two other neutral colors that I can use in my work because I really like the texture of all the layers. I like this ruffled edge, this little frayed edge. So this is how I play around with it. Now I'll start by just piecing my piece together. So I have my background piece, trim it up a little more. And sometimes I like to make it larger than I'll maybe use in the end. So I'll keep the focal point tight together, and that way when I'm ready to use it in my work, I can trim it down if needed. And I do like the additional layers here. I think the key looks best against a lighter background, but I really do like this layer, this color, this fabric. So I'm going to trim this down as well. And because I like that frayed edge, I'll just pull that apart. So my piece is starting to come together, the different layers. I'll layer this piece here. I'll fray this edge here. And then I want to add another layer to my piece. So I'll trim this down. Don't really need it to be much larger than that key. Fray that edge nicely. Yeah, that looks about right, and I can worry about this part of the piece later. So right now I'm going to tack my fabrics together, and I'll set my key aside. I'll use that pearl thread, and I'm just going to stitch around this center piece of fabric here. Just make little stitches. You can use any type of stitch you want. but I like just that little stitch just to tack it in place. So I'll space around and tack that down. And this is what it's like when it's all stitched around. This is a kind of an interesting piece. Again, I'm considering what to do with this. Maybe I'll just leave it for now. So now I'm ready to add my object. I can decide which direction I want it to go. And I want to incorporate textiles with this a little more, so it's not just the metal. So I'm going to take my thread. So now in order to wrap that, you can add a little dab of glue, or you can just start to wrap it. I like to leave a little tail on the end of my thread here because I can come back with that. And I bring my thread across the length of my piece. And then I start to wrap over that area that I've already set down. It's a little convoluted at first, but the point is to get a nice wrap. So I'll keep wrapping. Now one end is tucked. And then I can wrap it as much as I want, as thick as I want that to go. And when I'm pleased with how it looks, I'll take my needle and go through the wrapping, pulling that thread taut, and then I'll clip it. I'll tuck that end. And now on this side, I'll just thread my needle and do the same thing by bringing that needle and that thread through that little wrapping. So now I've threaded my needle, and I'm just going to bring my needle through that wrapping, just enough to really hook it on and anchor it in place. It's a little tough to get through, but it works just fine. And again, I trim that thread. And now I'll do the same thing with the gold. I want to keep all my knots on the underside or the same side. Bring out my thread. Hold it in place and then loop it over. And I do it just until I meet that area that I've already put the little coral color thread on. I can wrap it as many times as I want, and then I'll just stitch through it, coming out at the back. Now for this piece, I had left it a little bit longer. I'm not going to stitch through those little wraps. I'm going to stitch through my entire fabric, and that's going to anchor it in place. So I'll take my needle, rethread that string, hold my key exactly where I want it. I like it just like that. And then I'll stitch down, doing a few couching stitches, keeping my key in place, going over the area that I've already wrapped with this gold thread. So now I'll take some of that coral thread and I'll do a couching stitch over that area that we've already stitched to hold that key in place. Now after I have that in place, just as a design element and also to hold it in place a little bit better, I'm going to come over here and stitch a little of this coral on it using a couching stitch at the end of this key. And I want it to kind of look like a wrap. So I'll consider how many stitches I want to make to really anchor it in place. And that's the beauty of this. With each different element you have, you can do interesting and different things to really integrate it into your work. I can come in And with the gold thread, stitch the ends as well, and even work on the inside of this key if I wanted. I have a lot of options. So I'll knot this on the back, and then consider if I want to do a little more design work on this. So I do think I want to go in there with the gold thread and just anchor it on both of those sides and take advantage of that element on the key. So that's how I take a metal found object and use it in my slow stitching. It's a very interesting result, and I love the way that looks. It's a little bit metallic, a little textile, it's a little bit of shiny, and it's kind of just something different. Not something I'd use in all my work, but it's definitely something that I enjoy using. Now let me show you some other examples of this technique. So here I have a little faux metal sprocket, and I attached it to my little backing here of canvas, and I stitched circles just to echo that shape after stitching it down with couching stitches. So that's another interesting little charm I can make using metallic found objects. Here's another one. I tend to have a lot of these circles. I think they're beautiful. I picked up on the fabric that was printed with little text here, and I stitched a letter A. Both of my daughters have names that begin with A, so A is near and dear to me. Here's one that was a little belt buckle. I repurposed it here. Because this is a very shiny metal instead of the duller metal of these, I wanted to use a dark fabric to really show off the contrast there. I added lots of layers for a fabric collage, even a little bit of lace to contrast with that nice shininess. And here's another little charm here. This was part of a bracelet. I flattened it out and just used the couching stitch and that beautiful gold thread. I folded a piece of canvas for the backing, and now I have a little piece there. Now you can also use these metallic pieces as your main focus. Here I used some of that faux metal ribbon. I cut it to size, layered it with different fabric, and then added more stitching. And if you wanted to use it in your work, you can just take one of your pre-made pieces, say this one for example. Here's a piece that I have already made, and it adds just a different little focal point when stitched down to my work. Again, I try and coordinate it with a piece that either had those colors or those shapes, something interesting. This has the boxes and this line and the color, so it kind of coordinates. I didn't do this intentionally to match with this. This was just something that I had. But if there was something in mind, maybe I would make this a little different, this little charm. I would echo some of these stitches and colors. Well, that's how you'd use it in your work.
So that's how I use a metal found object in my work. I don't use it all the time, but I do think it adds an interesting element. It's shiny, it's metallic, it adds a little weight, and depending on the tone of the metal, well, you can get an antique look or a really shiny and glitzy look. It's really up to you. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. Every time you push that like button, it really helps my channel. And I hope you'll consider becoming a member of the channel. You'll get behind the scene footage, you'll get videos, and you'll have access to a library with mostly slow stitching techniques, but other artist inspirational techniques as well. Thanks for joining me today.